He looked at her like she was something he'd accidentally stepped in. That was the first thing Mabel Dawson understood when Cornelius Hatch turned around on the platform of Riverbend's Main Street and saw her standing there in the snow. Two infants strapped against her body, her traveling coat straining at the buttons, her face red from 3 days of cold and motion. He didn't even try to hide it. He looked, and then he looked away, and then he looked back, as if hoping the first look had been wrong. It had not been wrong. "No," he said. Just that. One word, right there in front of half the town. If you've ever traveled across frozen country with two babies and nowhere left to go, if you've ever arrived somewhere believing you were expected, believing someone had chosen you, then you already know what that word does to a person. It doesn't just sting, it relocates something inside you that you can't find again for a very long time. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what happens next, because this story is only getting started. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The stagecoach from Millhaven had taken 3 days to reach Riverbend, and Mabel had not slept more than an hour of any of them. Edmund and Clara slept in shifts, which meant that one of them was always awake, always needing something: warmth, feeding, reassurance that the rocking wooden box they were traveling in was not, in fact, the end of everything. Mabel had learned to sleep sitting up sometime in her second trimester, a skill her husband Thomas had teased her about until the night he stopped breathing in his sleep and she woke up alone in a bed that had gone cold on one side. That had been 7 months ago. 7 months of trying to figure out what a woman alone does with twins in a town that had already decided she was more burden than person. Her sister-in-law Vera had been the one to find the advertisement. It had run in 3 different papers across 2 territories: a merchant in the frontier settlement of Riverbend seeking a wife of good character, reliable temperament, and willingness to assist in the management of a household and small commercial enterprise. Vera had read it aloud at the kitchen table like she was doing Mabel a favor, which in Vera's mind she probably was. "You can't keep living here," Vera had said. Not unkindly, just honestly, which was sometimes worse. "Thomas is gone. The boys need their room back, and frankly, Mabel, with 2 infants and no income, you're not going to find another situation." What Vera meant and didn't say was, no one is going to want you, not like this. Not with the weight you've carried since the pregnancy, not with 2 babies who aren't even 6 months old yet, not without a dowry or a trade or a family name worth mentioning. Mabel had written to Cornelius Hatch anyway. She'd written carefully, choosing every word, being honest about the twins, and direct about her situation. She had not lied. She wanted to be clear about that later, to herself, and to anyone who asked. She had not misrepresented anything. She told him she was a widow with infant children. She told him she was young and strong and willing to work. She told him she had some schooling and could manage accounts. He had written back. He'd said the children were no obstacle. He'd said he admired her forthrightness. He'd enclosed a banknote for the coach fare and told her to arrive before the first hard freeze. She'd arrived before the first hard freeze. She'd arrived with Edmund on her left side and Clara on her right, both of them bundled into the body wrap that her neighbor Mrs. Forsyth had sewn from a wool blanket, and she'd stepped off that coach onto the main street of Riverbend, believing that the worst part was already over. The worst part had been standing right there waiting for her. Cornelius Hatch was a big man. Not fat. Big. Broad through the chest and shoulders, well-dressed for a frontier town. The kind of man who wore his prosperity visibly and on purpose. He had a thick, dark mustache and small eyes that missed very little. He'd been standing with 2 other men when the coach pulled in, and he'd separated from them and come forward when Mabel climbed down. And she'd thought for one brief, embarrassing moment that she was about to be welcomed somewhere. Then he'd gotten close enough to see her clearly. The change in his face happened fast. She almost missed it. A flicker, a tightening around the jaw, a very slight step backward. Then the mask came back up and he smiled. But the smile was the kind people put on when they're deciding how to handle something unexpected. "Mrs. Dawson," he said, "Mr. Hatch." She extended her hand as best she could with both babies wrapped against her. "It's good to meet you at last." He shook her hand briefly and let go. His eyes had moved to the twins and they stayed there for a moment too long, the way eyes do when they're doing calculations rather than seeing. "You brought both of them," he said. "I mentioned them in my letters. Both of them. Edmund and Clara. Yes. He said the word like it was something he was setting down carefully. I suppose I had a different. I think I may have understood the situation somewhat differently. Around them, Riverbend was doing what small frontier towns do. It was watching. Three women near the dry goods store had stopped their conversation. A man in a leather apron had appeared in a doorway. Two boys of maybe 12 had drifted closer on some pretext or another, because boys that age can smell trouble forming and find it irresistible. Mabel felt all of it, the cold, the eyes, the careful, deliberate way Cornelius Hatch was choosing his next words. "Mr. Hatch," she said, "if there's something you'd like to discuss, perhaps we could step inside somewhere. The babies are. I don't think that will be necessary." He had made his decision. She could see it happen, the moment his face stopped working on the problem and simply arrived at the answer. "I have to be honest with you, Mrs. Dawson. I'm a man of standing in this community. I have a business reputation to maintain, and there are expectations about the kind of household I keep and the kind of—" He paused, cleared his throat, tried a different angle. "You are not what I was expecting." The cold was very specific at that moment. It had a location. It lived right in the center of Mabel's chest, just below where Edmund's head was resting against her. "I see," she said. "I think it would be better for both of us if we parted ways here. I'll of course reimburse your return fare." "You'll reimburse my return fare," she said. She wasn't asking. She was repeating it back to him slowly, the way you repeat something back when you need a moment to understand that it's actually happening. "That seems the fair thing to do." The two men he'd been standing with earlier had drifted a few feet closer. One of them, heavy-set, wearing a merchant's apron, had the particular look of a man who is trying not to smile. The other was younger and had no expression at all, which was its own kind of cruelty. Mabel became aware that she had nothing to say. She had language. She had always had language, had been praised for it since girlhood, had written letters that Thomas used to say were better than anything in the newspapers. But at this particular moment, standing in the cold in front of a man who had just handed her back her entire future and called it fair, she had nothing. What she had instead was Clara, who had chosen this exact moment to wake up and make her displeasure known. The sound Clara produced was not subtle. It was the particular cry of an infant who has been too warm and too still for too long and has suddenly decided that this arrangement is unacceptable. It pierced the cold air with absolute authority. Edmund, by some mechanism of twin sympathy that Mabel had already learned to dread, woke up 2 seconds later and joined in. Cornelius Hatch took a full step back. "I'm sorry," he said, and he didn't sound sorry at all. He sounded like a man who is surprised to discover that the thing he invited in is louder than expected. "I'm sure you'll find your situation resolves itself. The return coach leaves on Thursday." He turned and walked back to his companions, and one of them said something low that Mabel couldn't hear, and there was a brief sound that might have been laughter. She stood there. Snow had started to come down again. Light stuff, almost mist, the kind that settles on your shoulders and eyelashes before you notice it. Edmund and Clara were crying. She was in the middle of a frontier town she had never seen before, with no family within 3 days' travel and exactly $7.40 to her name. She did not cry. She wanted to note that for whatever record might be kept of this particular moment. She did not cry, and she did not scream, and she did not do the thing she briefly imagined doing, which involved Cornelius Hatch's carefully groomed mustache and a very direct application of her right hand. She stood there, and she breathed, and she moved Edmund's head slightly so he was pressed more securely against her collarbone, and she looked down the length of Riverbend's main street and tried to figure out what came next. What came next was a voice, male, from somewhere to her left. "The children are underdressed for this temperature." She turned. He was standing in the doorway of a narrow building between the land office and the feed store, a building with a small painted sign above the door that she hadn't noticed before. The sign read, G. Hale, M.D. He was lean, somewhere in his late 30s, wearing a coat that had been good quality once and was now just functional. He had the look of someone who spent considerable time looking at things carefully before speaking, not slow, just precise. "I beg your pardon," she said. "Their faces." He nodded toward the twins. "You've got them well wrapped in the body, but their faces are exposed. At this temperature, 20 minutes is enough to matter." He paused. "There's a stove inside if you'd like to come in and let them warm up while you determine your next step." It wasn't an offer of rescue. It wasn't pity. It was someone looking at a situation and identifying what was immediately, practically wrong with it, and addressing that specific thing. Mabel didn't know why that mattered so much. It might have been that everything else she'd received in the last 10 minutes had been about her, what she looked like, what she'd failed to be, what Cornelius Hatch had been expecting, and this man was looking at her children. "Thank you," she said. She walked towards him, and he held the door open, and she stepped inside. The clinic was small, a front room with 2 chairs, a desk, a cabinet of instruments behind glass, and yes, a stove, burning steady and serious in the corner. It smelled like wood smoke, and something clean and sharp that she'd later learn was carbolic solution. There was a door to an examination room in the back, and another that she assumed led to living quarters. The man, Dr. Hale, presumably, closed the door behind her and went directly to the stove and added another piece of wood without being asked. "Sit down if you like," he said. "Do they need feeding?" "They need to calm down first. They're not hungry. She sat in one of the chairs and adjusted the wrap so both faces were turned toward the stove's warmth. "They're upset. They've been traveling 3 days. So have you, I'd imagine." "Yes." He sat down at the desk but didn't make any show of looking busy or looking away. He just sat, which was something she'd noticed later about. He was one of those rare people who could simply be present in a room without performing anything. "You came to marry Hatch," he said. It wasn't a question. "I came because he invited me," she said. "I wouldn't have described it as coming to marry him exactly. We hadn't met." "What would you have described it as?" She thought about this. "Coming to see if something was possible," she said. "For my children, mostly. My husband died in the spring, Thomas. He was—" She stopped, started again. "We didn't have much. Afterward, I had less." He offered a situation that seemed reasonable, Hale said. "Yes, reasonable." Clara had calmed down. Edmund was working on it, making the specific sounds of an infant who is angry about being angry and would very much like someone to explain why he can't simply stop. Mabel rocked slightly without thinking about it, the automatic motion that she suspected she would probably make for the rest of her life. "He's done it before," Hale said. She looked up. "Hatch. He's placed similar advertisements twice before. Both women arrived. Both were sent back on the return coach." He said it flatly, not with particular judgment, just as information. "The first one was a widow as well, older. He told the town she'd misrepresented her appearance. The second had a limp she hadn't mentioned." Mabel sat with this for a moment. "He's using the advertisements to—" She stopped because she wasn't sure how to finish that sentence without saying something she couldn't take back. "To position himself as a man with high standards, yes," Hale said. "It costs him very little and earns him a certain—" He paused, looking for the word. "Social performance, rejection, if done publicly and casually, reads as discernment in a town like this. He humiliated those women. He considers that an incidental consequence." The word incidental landed somewhere in Mabel with a specific weight. She looked down at her children, at Edmund, who had finally stopped fighting his anger and fallen into the sudden, absolute sleep of the very young. And she thought about the $7.40 and the return coach on Thursday and her sister-in-law Vera's face when she came back. "I'm not going back," she said. She hadn't entirely decided this before she said it, but she heard herself say it and recognized it as true. Hale looked at her with the same careful attention he'd been giving her since she walked in. Not surprised, not approving either, just noting. "What will you do instead?" he said. "I don't know yet, but I'll figure it out here." She looked around the small clinic, at the glass-fronted cabinet, the desk, the stove. "Do you need any help with the clinic?" He blinked. It was the first time she'd seen him do anything that looked like surprise. "I have no experience," she said quickly. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not a nurse. I've never trained. But I learn fast and I'm not delicate and I won't faint at the sight of things." She paused. "I can cook and I can manage accounts. I have some schooling. I can keep records." He was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to be uncomfortable. "I can't pay much," he said. "I don't need much. I need somewhere to stay and something to do." He looked at her, really looked, the way he'd looked at the twins on the street, with that same quality of assessment, that had nothing sentimental in it and nothing cruel, just honest, square attention. "There's a room in the back," he said finally. "It's bin storage. I can clear it." "I can clear it myself." "All right." She nodded. He nodded. Edmund slept against her chest. Clara had her eyes open and was studying the ceiling with the baffled intensity of someone encountering it for the first time. It wasn't a rescue. Mabel was clear about that even then, in the first 10 minutes of it. It was a transaction, an exchange of practical needs between two people who had each run out of better options. That was all it was. She told herself that several times over the next few days. By the end of the first week, she had cleared the storage room, set up a sleeping space with a borrowed cot, and a drawer padded with folded blankets for the twins, and learned the basic rhythm of the clinic. Morning was for preparation. Instruments cleaned, supplies inventoried, examination room set in order. Midday brought whoever needed bringing, the farmer with the infected hand, the child with the persistent cough, the old woman whose joints had been slowly turning on her for years. Evening was for records, for notes, for Hale sitting at his desk with a lamp and writing up what he'd seen and what he'd done. Mabel started reading the notes. She didn't tell him, she just read them. In the evenings after the twins were down, by the light of her own small lamp in the storage room, working through the handwriting that was cramped and fast and not designed for anyone else's eyes. She understood about half of it at first, then more. She started writing questions on a separate piece of paper, questions she didn't ask yet, just cataloged. Names of things she didn't know, procedures she couldn't picture, words that had specific meanings she was guessing at. On the 9th day, he came in from the examination room and found her at the front desk with one of his reference texts open beside the patient log, cross-referencing an entry about a poultice treatment with the pharmacological description in the book. He stood in the doorway. She looked up. "I know it's your book," she said. "I was careful with it." He looked at the text, then at the patient log, then at her. "What were you looking for?" "You used a plantain poultice on Mr. Garrett's hand last Thursday. I was trying to understand why that instead of a standard iodine dressing." He came into the room and stood across the desk from her and looked at the open pages. "The infection was already draining," he said. "The plantain draws without the caustic effect. With iodine, you risk tissue damage at a stage where you want the body to do its own work." She looked at the text. "This description suggests the same. I wasn't sure if I was reading it right." "You were reading it right." She closed the book carefully and set it back on the correct corner of the desk. "The Calloway woman is coming back tomorrow," she said. "Her second trimester, I think, based on the last 2 entries. Should I prepare anything ahead of her visit?" He was still looking at her with that careful expression she'd seen on the street. "There's a smaller reference text on obstetrical care in the top left drawer. You can review it tonight if you want to be prepared." "All right," she said. "And Mabel." She looked up at the use of her name. He hadn't used it much in the first week. She'd been Mrs. Dawson, formally, which was fine. "The questions you've been writing down," he said. "On the folded paper you keep in your left pocket." She felt a flash of something. Embarrassment, maybe, or the defensiveness that comes from being seen doing something private. "You can ask them," he said. "In the evenings, when the work is finished, I'll answer what I can." She nodded. He went back to the examination room. She sat for a moment in the quiet clinic, with the stove burning and both twins asleep in the back room and the patient log open under her hands, and felt something she hadn't felt since March. Something that wasn't hope exactly, but was in the same family. A sense of direction. A forward-pointing thing. It wasn't much. But in Riverbend, in December, after what Cornelius Hatch had said to her on the main street with half the town watching, it was enough to matter. What she didn't know yet, couldn't know, standing in that small warm clinic with snow coming down outside and her children sleeping 20 feet away, was that direction has its own momentum. That you can start moving because you have no other choice and end up somewhere you never imagined because you kept moving after the emergency was over. She didn't know yet that Riverbend was watching her, not with kindness, not yet, but watching. The way a town watches something it hasn't decided what to make of yet, which is its own kind of attention, and which can turn in any direction depending on what happens next. She folded her list of questions and put it back in her left pocket and went to check on the twins. Outside, the snow came down on Riverbend's main street, and the lamplight in Dr. Hale's clinic was the only window still lit on that end of the block, and a woman who had arrived with nothing was already becoming someone the town would have to decide how to handle. It would take them a while to make up their minds. It would take her rather less time than that. The questions in her left pocket numbered 14 by the end of the second week. She'd added to them in the evenings, after the clinic closed and the twins were down, and Hale had retreated to whatever he did in the back room before sleep. She could sometimes hear him moving, the creak of a chair, the occasional sound of pages turning. She'd sit at the front desk with her lamp and his reference texts and write her questions in the small, even hand that her schoolteacher had drilled into her at age 7 and that she'd never been able to shake loose. The questions weren't simple ones. They weren't "what does this word mean" questions, though she'd had plenty of those in the first week. By the second week, they were things like, why does the fever in an infected wound behave differently from the fever in a chest sickness? And is the difference in the body's response or in the thing causing the response? She didn't know enough to know whether these were good questions or obvious ones, which was its own kind of uncomfortable. On the 14th day, she asked them. Hale had the particular quality of attention that some people bring to things they care about and most people only simulate. When she read out the first question, about the wound fever, he didn't answer immediately. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then he looked at her and said, "That's 2 questions, not 1. The mechanism and the origin are separate problems." "All right," she said. "Then I have 15 questions." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, more like the expression of someone who has been handed something unexpected and isn't sure yet what to do with it. He answered all 15. It took the better part of 2 hours. Clara woke up partway through and Mabel fed her without stopping the conversation, and Hale kept talking, drawing small diagrams on a piece of paper when the explanation needed a visual anchor, pushing the paper across the desk so she could see, then pulling it back to add something. It was the most she'd heard him speak at one time since she'd arrived. He was not a naturally expansive man. He chose his words the way you choose tools, for fit and function rather than decoration. But when he had something specific to explain, he was precise and thorough and didn't talk down. At the end, she had 6 new questions. She wrote them down. "Tomorrow," he said, standing. "Tomorrow," she agreed. That was how it started. Not with any formal arrangement, not with anything said directly about what it was. Just 2 people at a desk in the evenings, one asking and one answering, and the questions getting more complicated as the weeks went on. January came in hard. The temperature dropped past the point where you stopped announcing it because the number ceased to mean anything useful, and the clinic got busier in the specific ways that severe cold makes clinics busy. Frostbite, respiratory illness, the injuries that come from people working outdoors because the animals still need feeding regardless of the thermometer. Mabel learned to recognize the difference between a cough that needed monitoring and a cough that needed immediate action. She learned how to clean and dress a wound without Hale standing over her. She learned that some patients would tell a woman things they wouldn't tell a doctor, which was its own kind of medical information, and sometimes the most important kind. She also learned that Riverbend had opinions about her. The first time she heard it directly was from a woman named Mrs. Pruitt, who came in with her daughter in late January and spent the entire examination speaking past Mabel to the door of the back room, waiting for Hale to emerge, refusing to address any of Mabel's intake questions with more than a single syllable. When Hale came out and confirmed what Mabel had already told her, that the daughter's rash was contact dermatitis, not contagious, treatable with a specific ointment. Mrs. Pruitt thanked him warmly and left without looking at Mabel once. In the doorway, though, she paused. She'd apparently forgotten that sound carries in small rooms. "I don't know why he keeps that woman on," she said to her daughter, just outside the door. "It isn't appropriate. A widow with 2 infants, living right there in the clinic. It doesn't look right." Her daughter said something Mabel couldn't hear. "I know, but still," Mrs. Pruitt said, "and the size of her. I feel sorry for the poor man, honestly." The door closed. Mabel stood at the front desk with the patient log open under her hands and did not move for a moment. Then she wrote down Mrs. Pruitt's visit in the log, date, presenting complaint, diagnosis, treatment, in her small even hand, and closed the book, and went to check on the twins. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself this several times, with varying degrees of conviction. The difficulty was that Mrs. Pruitt was not a singular event. She was a representative of a position, and that position had adherents. Mabel became aware of it the way you become aware of weather. Gradually, and then all at once. The women who crossed the street rather than past the clinic door. The comments made in the dry goods store that stopped when she entered, the specific quality of attention she received at the post office, which was not the attention you give someone you respect, and not quite the attention you give someone you pity. It was the attention you give something that doesn't fit, something that is present in a place where it complicates the established order of things. She was too heavy for a professional setting. She was too forward for a widow. She was too bold for someone in her situation. She was living in a single man's premises, and never mind that there was a storage room between them, and she'd have heard him coming through 2 doors and a hallway. Perception is not interested in floor plans. What surprised her was where it came from. It wasn't the poorer families, the homesteaders, the farmers' wives who came in with their children. Those women, when they came to the clinic, looked at her with something more like recognition. A woman who'd had to figure things out under pressure recognized another woman doing the same thing, and there was no social performance required. They answered her intake questions. They accepted her assessments. One woman, Mrs. Calloway, the pregnancy Hale had told her to review for, said flat out on her 3rd visit, "You're easier to talk to than he is, no offense to him." "None taken," Mabel said, and meant it. It was the prosperous end of Riverbend that had the problem with her. The merchant-class families, the town councilmen's wives, the women whose social standing depended on a clear and maintained order of who belongs where. These were the women who had, presumably, watched Cornelius Hatch reject her on the street in December and drawn their own conclusions, that his judgment was correct, that her presence in Riverbend was a problem that hadn't been properly resolved. Cornelius Hatch himself she saw twice in January, both times on the main street at enough distance that acknowledgement wasn't required. The first time he looked through her. The second time she looked through him first, which cost her something, but was worth it. February brought a development she hadn't anticipated. It started with a boy named Eli Marsh, 9 years old, who came into the clinic one Thursday morning alone, without an adult, which was unusual enough that Mabel came out from behind the desk and crouched down in front of him before she asked what was wrong. His father had a cut on his leg that had been there for 2 weeks, and was now hot and swollen, and had a smell, Eli said, and he said it in the flat, careful way of a child who has learned to report bad things without showing how scared he is. Mabel sent him to get Hale and went for the supply cabinet. The wound was worse than bad. It was the kind of infected cut that happens when a working man decides he can manage it himself because he can't afford to lose a day's work, and then 2 days becomes a week, and a week becomes 2. And by the time anyone sees it, the infection has moved well past the wound itself and into the surrounding tissue. Hale worked for nearly 2 hours. Mabel held the lamp, passed instruments, held the man's arm when the pain cut through the laudanum, and watched everything Hale did with the focused attention she brought to all of it. Afterward, when Eli's father, a man named Roy, broad-shouldered, embarrassed about the whole thing in the specific way that men are embarrassed about needing help, was resting in the examination room, Eli appeared in the doorway. "Is he going to die?" he asked. Hale opened his mouth. Mabel spoke first. "Not if he stays in that bed for the next 3 days and doesn't do anything stupid," she said. "Which means you're going to have to handle the morning chores. Can you do that?" Eli looked at her. He was clearly deciding whether to be offended by the bluntness. "I've been doing them anyway," he said, while he was too stubborn to come in. "Good. Then you already know what to do." She paused. "Come back tomorrow and I'll show you how to change the dressing, so you can do it at home when he's well enough to move." Something happened in the boy's face. Not relief exactly. Something more complicated. The particular expression of a child who has been carrying more than children should carry and has just been handed a tool instead of a platitude. He came back the next morning. She showed him the dressing procedure 3 times until he could do it with his eyes tracking each step. He was a precise, serious student, which made sense given what she now knew about his household. Roy Marsh went home 4 days later with both legs intact and a son who knew how to change a wound dressing. The following week, Eli's mother came to the clinic. She was a slight woman, younger than Mabel had expected, with the tired around the eyes look of someone managing a lot on not much. She brought a jar of preserved peaches. "Eli talks about you," she said, "about what you showed him. He was very—" She stopped, chose a word. "Relieved. To be able to do something." "I was already doing something," Mabel said. "I just gave him another tool." Mrs. Marsh set the peaches on the desk. She looked at Mabel directly for a moment, not with the assessment that felt like measurement, but with something more straightforward. Mrs. Pruitt is telling people you're not qualified to be here, she said. I thought you should know. Mabel had already known, in the way you know things that are being said in rooms you're not in, but hearing it stated plainly was different. What is she saying specifically? That Dr. Hale should have a trained nurse, she says, not a charity case who wandered in off the street. Mabel absorbed this. She also says, Mrs. Marsh continued, that you're angling to marry him for his establishment. She's been saying it for several weeks. And what do people think? Some believe her. Some don't care either way. Mrs. Marsh looked at the preserved peaches, then back at Mabel. My husband's leg is attached to his body. That's what I think. After she left, Mabel sat at the front desk for a long time without doing anything in particular. Edmund was in the padded drawer that had become his preferred napping spot. He'd protested the borrowed cot almost from the beginning and had made his preferences clear. Clara was awake, watching the middle distance with the precocious, unsettling focus she brought to everything. Mabel looked at her daughter. What would you do? She said. Clara blinked. Right, Mabel said. She picked up the patient log and went back to work. What she did, over the next several weeks, was the thing she knew how to do. She kept working. She didn't address the rumors directly, and she didn't modify her behavior in response to them, and she didn't perform any kind of campaign of rehabilitation. She showed up in the mornings, and she was competent and she was decent to everyone who came through the door, and she let that be the argument. It was not, she understood, a fast argument. It did not have the satisfying immediacy of a confrontation or a rebuttal. It was the slow work of accumulation, reputation built by increment, like sediment, invisible until it has weight. But she had nothing faster available, so she did the slow work. March brought two things: a late blizzard that lasted 4 days and kept most of Riverbend indoors, and a woman named Dorothea Castle, who came to the clinic on the 3rd day of the blizzard with a broken wrist she'd gotten falling on the ice and a manner that was simultaneously grand and brittle, like expensive china that's been handled too many times. Dorothea Castle was the wife of Lawrence Castle, who owned the largest dry goods operation in Riverbend and sat on the town council and was, by common consensus, one of the 3 most influential men in the territory. She was in her 50s, finely dressed even in the blizzard, and she had the kind of bearing that suggested she'd walked into every room she'd ever entered with the clear understanding that the room should adjust to her rather than the other way around. She looked at Mabel when she came in, and she looked at the twins, and she looked at the clinic, and she said, "Where's Dr. Hale?" "He's finishing with another patient," Mabel said. "I can begin the intake while you wait. Can you tell me how the fall happened?" "I'd rather wait for the doctor." "Of course. Can I get you something while you wait?" "The wrist should be elevated. I know how to manage a wrist injury, thank you." Mabel nodded and went back to the desk. Dorothea Castle sat in the patient chair and held her wrist at a careful angle and looked around the clinic with an expression that managed to convey thorough assessment without appearing to look at anything directly. Her eyes moved to the patient log, to the supply cabinet, to the small frame diagram of the musculoskeletal hand that Mabel had tacked to the wall beside the desk, because she kept needing to reference it. "Why is that there?" she said, nodding at the diagram. "I reference it," Mabel said. "You read medical texts?" "I read what's available." A pause. "Self-taught?" "Largely." Another pause, longer. "My mother was self-taught," Dorothea said abruptly. "Not medicine, accounting. No one would teach her formally. She kept the books for my father's business for 30 years, and he never formally acknowledged it." She said this without particular bitterness, as though reporting a weather pattern that had existed before her arrival and continued after. He was not a malicious man. He simply operated within the assumptions available to him. Mabel wasn't sure what to do with this, so she said, "I'm sorry." "Don't be." She knew what she was doing and she did it, and the business survived on the strength of it. That was enough for her. Dorothea looked at the diagram again. Whether it was enough is a separate question. Hale came out of the back room. He examined the wrist, confirmed the break, set it, wrapped it. It was efficient and careful and professional, and Dorothea Castle was composed throughout in the manner of someone who has decided not to provide the room with any additional information about her internal state. At the end, she said to Hale, "Your assistant is teaching herself medicine." Hale looked at Mabel, then back at Dorothea. "Yes," he said, as though this was not a surprise. Is she competent? A brief pause. In the areas she's covered, yes. Dorothea Castle stood, moving carefully so as not to jostle the wrapped wrist. She looked at Mabel for the first time directly. Mrs. Pruitt is a woman with a great deal of time and a great deal of opinion, she said. Pay her the attention her arguments deserve and no more. She moved toward the door. Dr. Hale, send the account to my husband. She left. The clinic was quiet for a moment. What was that? Mabel said. I believe that was Dorothea Castle deciding something, Hale said. He went to the supply cabinet and began restocking the things he'd used. She's useful to have on the correct side of a question. She hasn't said which side she's on. She told you not to worry about Pruitt. For Dorothea, that's a statement of alliance. He glanced back at her. It's also good advice. Mabel considered this. She said her mother kept books for 30 years without acknowledgement. Her father's business. Yes, it was moderately well known. He closed the cabinet. Lawrence Castle married her partly because she could do the same thing for his operation. She's been his accounts manager for 20 years. He refers to her as his wife in all public settings. And she accepts that. She accepts what's available to her while making use of everything it offers. He turned to face her. Not unlike someone else I can think of. Mabel looked at him. He had the expression he sometimes got when he said something that was more direct than he'd intended. Not quite embarrassed, but aware. I'll finish the morning inventory, she said. Yes, he said, and went back to the examination room. She stood at the desk and thought about Dorothea Castle's mother and the 30 years and the unacknowledged books. She thought about what enough means when you're doing work that matters, and no one will formally say so. She thought about whether the word enough was something you got to define yourself or whether it required external confirmation to mean anything. She didn't arrive at a clean answer. In her experience, the clean answers were usually a sign that you were asking the wrong version of the question. April arrived and the twins learned to sit up, which changed the daily management of the clinic in ways both practical and unexpected. Edmund, sitting, became a creature of powerful opinions about his immediate surroundings and what should be done about them. Clara, sitting, became intensely interested in watching everything, her head tracking movement across the room with the patient intensity of a small, very serious scientist. 3 patients commented on Clara in the same week. Not kindly, not unkindly, just noticing. The way people notice things that are present in places they didn't expect to find them. A child in a clinic. Specifically, a child in this clinic, which was developing a reputation as a place that operated somewhat differently from what people expected of frontier medicine. Word had spread about Eli Marsh's father and the 2 weeks of infection that had been handled correctly in a single long afternoon, and the fact that the man had kept his leg. Word had also spread about the Calloway birth, a difficult labor that Hale had managed and Mabel had assisted, and which had ended with both mother and child surviving when the odds, at the worst point, had not been comfortable. Mrs. Calloway had said something about it afterward, to the women she talked to, and those women had talked to others. It was the specific arithmetic of a small town. The reputation you earn by showing up is always slower to build than the reputation you earn by being talked about, but the first kind has weight that the second kind doesn't. By April, Mabel had both kinds. The negative version was Mrs. Pruitt's construction, the too large widow who'd arrived uninvited and installed herself in a respectable man's clinic and had designs on his establishment. The positive version was quieter and less organized, but more specific. She was someone who explained things rather than just performing expertise at you, who remembered what you'd told her on the last visit, who didn't treat your fear like an inconvenience. She was aware of both versions. She tried not to invest too heavily in either. What she was less prepared for was the afternoon in late April when a young woman came in alone, wearing a dress that was too light for the remaining cold, and sat in the patient chair without explaining why she was there, and looked at her hands for a long time before she said anything. Her name was Nora. She was 19. She worked as a seamstress for a family on the east end of town, and she was pregnant, and the man responsible was someone who would not be acknowledging that responsibility in any public forum, and she needed to know what her options were. She said all of this to Mabel. Not to Hale, she'd asked specifically, at the door, whether she could speak to the woman. Mabel had taken her to the front room and closed the door to the back. Does he know? Mabel said. He knows. Nora's voice was flat in the specific way of someone who has moved past the part where they could afford to be emotional about it. He's offered me money to go to the next town and handle it. Mabel sat with that for a moment. Handle it, she repeated. Yes. And what do you want? Nora looked up. It appeared she hadn't been asked this recently. I don't know, she said, which was honest. I can't stay here. I can't go home. My family is in Ohio and my father would… She stopped. I don't know what I want. I know what I can't do. They talked for over an hour. Mabel didn't give her answers she didn't have. She told her what she knew about the practical situation, what a pregnancy at this stage involved, what resources existed, which women in Riverbend might be trusted with the information. She was careful not to tell Nora what she should feel or what she should decide, because she'd been told what she should feel and should decide for most of the last year, and she knew what that was worth. Before she left, Nora said, Mrs. Pruitt says you shouldn't be here. I know. She says you're not qualified. For some things, she's right. Mabel looked at her directly. But you didn't come here today for a medical qualification. You came here because you needed someone to talk to who wouldn't judge you before you finished the sentence. Nora looked at her for a moment. Then she stood, straightened her dress, and left. Mabel sat at the desk for a while afterward, not writing anything. The afternoon light came in through the front window at the angle it took in late April, long and thin and almost gold, and it lay across the patient log and the edge of the desk and the small frame diagram of the hand. Hale came out from the examination room at some point. He'd been aware that someone had come in and had stayed out of it, which she'd understood without being told. You all right? He said. Yes. She paused. There's a young woman in this town having a very bad spring. There usually is, he said, which was not callous. It was the voice of someone who had been keeping track of the town's sorrows long enough to know their patterns. He came and stood near the desk, not quite beside her, and looked at the afternoon light on the floor. Did you help her? I don't know yet. I didn't fix anything. That's not the same as not helping. She looked up at him. He was looking at the window, the particular faraway focus he got when he was thinking rather than seeing. Mrs. Pruitt came by while you were in with the patient, he said. Not as a patient. She came to speak to me. Mabel waited. She told me that several of the council families have concerns about the operation of the clinic, specifically about your role in it. He paused. She used the word unsuitable several times. What did you tell her? That she was welcome to find another clinic within 40 miles if the current arrangement displeased her. He paused again. She was not pleased by that. Mabel absorbed this. You didn't have to do that. I know. He looked at her now. I also told her that you'd handled more patient interactions in the last 4 months than most trained nurses manage in a year, and that your intake records were better than the ones I kept myself. She found that also unsuitable. She would. Yes. He moved toward the examination room. The Hendersons are coming in tomorrow morning. Mrs. Henderson has had the headaches for 3 weeks. I've been thinking it might be pressure-related. There's a chapter in the second volume on vascular symptoms, the blue cover, second shelf. I'll read it tonight. I know you will. He went back to his work. Mabel sat at the desk and opened the patient log and wrote Nora's visit in the coded shorthand she'd developed for sensitive cases. Enough information to be medically useful, not enough to identify the patient to anyone else. The afternoon light moved across the floor as the sun shifted. Edmund made a sound in the back room that suggested he was awake and assessing his situation and would be reporting his findings shortly. She finished the entry, capped the pen, and went to check on her son. Outside, Riverbend was making its way through another ordinary evening, lamplight coming on in windows, the sound of the farrier finishing his last work of the day, the smell of cook fires and cold air. The town was not, on balance, decided about her yet. That much she understood. But it was paying attention, and in a town like Riverbend, attention was the first step toward anything. She had learned to work with what was available. She went back to the desk and pulled the blue-covered volume from the shelf and opened it to the chapter on vascular symptoms and began to read. The letter from Franklin Pruitt arrived on a Monday in May, addressed to Dr. Gideon Hale and delivered by a boy who looked like he'd been told to wait for a response. There was no response. Hale read it, set it on the desk, and went back to the examination room without a word. Mabel picked it up. It was not a long letter. It was the kind of letter that people write when they've decided to move from talking to doing. 3 paragraphs. Formal in the way that threats become formal when the person making them wants a paper record. The first paragraph noted that several families of Standing in Riverbend had expressed concern about the operation of the clinic, and specifically about the role of Mrs. Mabel Dawson in its daily functions. The second paragraph suggested that this concern had been brought to the attention of 2 town council members who shared it. The third paragraph said that a formal petition would be presented to the full council at the June meeting requesting that the council review the clinic's staffing arrangements and consider whether they met the standards appropriate to a medical establishment serving the community. Staffing arrangements. She read that phrase twice. It was doing a great deal of work for 2 words. She set the letter back on the desk and went to check on the twins. Edmund was eating a piece of dried apple she'd given him, working at it with the serious concentration he brought to all food. Clara was sitting up against the wall with one of Hale's old medical texts open in her lap, which was not reading. She was 8 months old, but was already her characteristic posture when she wanted to look like she was engaged with something important. Mabel sat on the floor between them and looked at the doorway and thought about Franklin Pruitt and his 3 paragraphs. The difficulty was that the letter was not wrong about everything. She was not a trained nurse. She was not a licensed practitioner. She had no formal credential that she could produce for a council review, nothing on paper that established her right to do the work she'd been doing for 5 months. What she had was a record of outcomes, a set of patient relationships, and a growing competence that existed entirely inside her own head and Hale's daily trust of it, neither of which would mean much to a council looking for something to cite. She'd known this was coming. She hadn't known when, but she'd understood since February, since Mrs. Marsh had brought the preserved peaches and the information about what Mrs. Pruitt was saying, that the informal arrangement could not hold indefinitely against organized opposition. The question she hadn't answered for herself was what she was going to do about it when it arrived. She picked Clara up and held her for a moment. "I don't know yet," she said. Clara looked at her with the dark, unreadable attention of a baby who has recently discovered that adults say things that aren't directed at them and finds this interesting. Mabel put her back down, stood up, and went to talk to Hale. He was in the examination room reviewing notes from the morning's cases. He didn't look up when she came in, which meant he knew why she was there and was deciding how to handle it, which was what he did when he was uncomfortable. He extended the task in front of him slightly past its natural endpoint. "The council meeting is 4 weeks away," she said. "Yes. Is there anything we can do before then?" He set the notes down. "Legally, no. The petition is within their authority. The review is within their authority." He paused. "What they can actually require of me is limited. I run a private medical practice, not a public institution. They can't dictate my staffing, but they can make things difficult in other ways: licensing pressure, supply access, the kind of friction that doesn't stop you, but costs you. And if I'm not here when the review happens, then there's less for them to review." He looked at her directly. "Is that what you're suggesting?" "I'm asking if it's what you're suggesting." He was quiet long enough that she understood the silence. "No," he said finally. "It's not what I'm suggesting." "Then we need a different answer." What the different answer looked like over the following 4 weeks was work. Not a campaign, not a counteroffensive, just work. The same work they'd been doing, but with a heightened awareness of what it produced and for whom. Every case that came through the clinic in May became, without anyone saying so, part of an argument. Mabel documented everything with more care than she'd even previously brought to it. Intake notes detailed and specific, treatment observations thorough, outcomes tracked in the patient log with dates and follow-up entries. She also, for the first time, started keeping a second ledger. It wasn't official. It wasn't something she showed Hale or told anyone about. It was a plain notebook she bought at the dry goods store, and in it she kept a different kind of record. Not medical, but relational. Who had come in? What they'd said about the clinic, about the care, about her specifically. What families had sent their children. What happened afterward. It was the kind of documentation that doesn't have a formal name, but that anyone who's ever had to defend their position understands instinctively. Evidence that your presence has produced something real, something that would be missed if you were gone. She did not know if she would ever use it. She kept it anyway. Nora came back in the 3rd week of May. She came in the morning, early, before most of Riverbend was moving. She looked better than she had in April. Not well, but better. which was its own kind of information. She sat in the patient chair and told Mabel that she'd made a decision, that she'd written to a cousin in St. Louis who had agreed to take her in, that she was leaving Riverbend at the end of the month. "That's a good option," Mabel said. "It's the least bad option," Nora said, which was honest. "I know the difference." "Yes, so do I." Nora looked at her hands. "I heard about the letter, the Pruitt petition." Mabel waited. "The man who—" Nora stopped, started again. "The man I told you about. He's connected to the Pruitt family. His wife is Pruitt's niece." She looked up. "I don't know if that matters. I just thought you should know." Mabel sat very still for a moment. "It matters," she said carefully, "in the sense that it explains some of the timing. I don't think it changes what I need to do. I could say something about what he did. I could, if it would help you." "No," Mabel said it immediately and firmly. "Your situation is not a tool for mine. That's not how this works." Nora looked at her with an expression that was complicated. Gratitude mixed with something that looked like it might eventually become anger, the productive kind, the kind that knows what it's for. "I'm going to be all right," Nora said. It was partly a statement and partly a question. "Yes," Mabel said. "You are." She said it without qualification, because Nora needed the statement, not the hedge, and because Mabel believed it was true in the way that things are true when someone has shown you the specific quality of their survival instinct, and you've recognized it as sufficient. After she left, Mabel sat for a while. Then she wrote the visit in the coded shorthand and closed the notebook and went to start the morning inventory. The council meeting was set for the second Thursday of June. The week before it, Dorothea Castle came to the clinic. Not as a patient. The wrist had healed cleanly in April, and she'd come in once for a follow-up and declared herself satisfied in the way she declared most things, as a matter-of-fact conclusion rather than an expression of relief. This visit was different. She came in the afternoon when the patient flow had quieted, and she sat in the chair across from Mabel's desk and looked at her with the direct, unadorned attention that Mabel had come to recognize as Dorothea's version of respect. "I want to know what you're planning to do about Thursday," Dorothea said. "I'm planning to attend the meeting." "And?" "And speak, if they'll allow it." "They'll allow it." Dorothea said this with the certainty of someone who knows how meetings run because she has been managing outcomes in rooms like that for decades, unofficially. "Lawrence will see to that. What will you say?" Mabel had been thinking about this for 4 weeks. She had drafts, actual written drafts, which she hadn't shown anyone, which she'd revised 3 times. She'd approached it the way she'd approached the pharmacological sections of her study. Identify what you know, identify what you don't, address the gaps. "I'll say what's true," she said, "what the record shows, what the patients have experienced." "That's a start." Dorothea looked at the patient log. "You know what Pruitt will say? He'll say the question isn't outcomes, it's qualifications. He'll separate the results from the process and argue that the process was improper, regardless of what it produced." "I know. Do you have an answer for that?" "I have an honest answer, which is that the qualifications argument is designed to exclude people like me regardless of competence, and that the council should be more interested in what the clinic has actually done than in whether I hold a piece of paper." Dorothea was quiet for a moment. "That's true," she said. "It's also not the argument that wins in a council chamber." "What argument wins in a council chamber?" Dorothea looked at her steadily. "The argument that makes the alternative look worse than the current situation." She paused. "What does Riverbend look like without you in this clinic?" Mabel thought about it. "Slower," she said. "Hale can only see so many patients in a day. The intake work, the documentation, the follow-up. He can't do all of it alone and maintain the patient volume we have now. Families who've come to depend on the clinic would have reduced access. The Marsh boy's father might have lost his leg." She paused. "The Calloway baby might not have—" "Stop there," Dorothea said. "That's the argument. Not what you can do, what doesn't happen if you can't do it." She stood. "Make them see the cost of removing you, not just to you, to them." After she left, Mabel sat at the desk and rewrote her notes. Thursday came with the particular clear sky indifference that June mornings have on the frontier, the kind of weather that doesn't register anything happening beneath it. The council met in the large room above the land office, which had wooden chairs arranged in rows and smelled like sawdust and old paper and the specific staleness of official proceedings. Mabel arrived early. She sat in the second row, not the front, close enough to be visible, not so close as to appear aggressive about it. Hale sat beside her. He had dressed carefully, she noticed, which was unlike him. He usually wore whatever was clean and functional, but today his coat was pressed and his collar was straight, and she understood that this was its own kind of statement. The room filled. More people came than she expected. The Pruitt faction arrived in a group. Franklin Pruitt, two other council members she recognized, three merchants' wives who positioned themselves in the back row with the organized air of people who have assigned themselves a role. But there were others too. Roy Marsh in the third row, without Eli this time, but with the set expression of someone who intends to stay to the end. The Hendersons. Mrs. Calloway, who had come with the baby who was now 5 months old and healthy and present in the room as its own kind of evidence. Dorothea Castle sat in the front row. Lawrence Castle sat beside her. Neither of them looked at Mabel when she came in, which she understood was not coldness, but strategy. The meeting opened with the standard business that council meetings use to establish the weight of their own authority: minutes, reports, approvals of things already decided. Then Lawrence Castle said that the council would hear the petition submitted by Franklin Pruitt regarding the staffing arrangements at the Hale Medical Clinic. Pruitt stood. He was a compact man, carefully assembled, the kind who kept his voice measured because he understood that measured voices are harder to argue against than passionate ones. He made the argument Dorothea had predicted: qualifications, standards, the responsibility of the council to ensure that medical care in Riverbend met appropriate criteria, the risk to public trust if the clinic's personnel were seen to operate outside the bounds of professional certification. He did not say her name once. He said her name precisely 0 times in a 7-minute address, which was its own technique. Remove the person, make the problem abstract, make it about standards and procedures rather than about a specific woman who had been doing specific work for 5 months with specific results. She recognized it because she'd been on the receiving end of it before, in different contexts, in smaller rooms. 2 of the council members asked questions. Both questions were about liability. If an uncertified practitioner made an error, who was responsible? Pruitt said this was exactly his concern. Then Castle asked if anyone else wished to speak. Hale stood first. He spoke for 3 minutes. He was not a man given to speeches, and this was not a speech. It was a clinical report, delivered in the same direct, precise language he used in his examination notes. He described the patient volume the clinic managed. He described the specific functions Mabel performed and the standard to which she performed them. He described 2 cases, Roy Marsh's leg, the Calloway birth, in clinical detail, not as emotional appeals but as documented outcomes that could be verified against the patient record. He said that in his professional judgment, Mrs. Dawson's contributions to the clinic were not supplementary but structural, and that to remove them would reduce the clinic's capacity to serve the community in measurable and specific ways. He sat down. Mabel stood. She had her notes, but she didn't look at them. "Mr. Cassell," she said, "members of the council, Mr. Pruitt has made an argument about qualifications, and I want to address it directly." She paused. "He is correct that I have no formal certification. I arrived in Riverbend in December with no credentials and no formal medical training. I learned what I know in the 5 months since, through study and practice, and the direct instruction of Dr. Hale, who is the most capable physician I have encountered in my life. I am not going to stand here and pretend that this is equivalent to formal training, because it isn't." The room was quiet. "What I'm going to say is this. Mrs. Calloway's daughter is in this room today. Roy Marsh came to this meeting on 2 working legs. Eli Marsh, who is 9 years old, knows how to change a wound dressing correctly because I showed him, and that knowledge kept his father's wound properly managed between clinic visits. Mrs. Henderson has not had a debilitating headache in 2 months. These are not my credentials. They're the clinic's record. I happen to be part of how that record was built." She paused. In the back row, one of the merchant's wives had stopped looking at her hands. "Mr. Pruitt asks the council to consider what happens if my role continues without formal review. I want to ask the council to consider what happens to this community if it doesn't." She looked at Castle, then let her eyes move across the room. Dr. Hale is one physician serving a territory that needs 3. He manages that gap because the clinic operates the way it does. If the staffing arrangement changes, the gap doesn't close, it gets larger. The families who have come to depend on this clinic don't stop needing medical care. They just stop being able to get it as readily. I would ask the council to weigh that specific cost against the abstract concern about credentials. She sat down. The room had the texture of a space in which something has shifted and people are recalibrating where they stand. Pruitt said, "The issue of standards, Mr. Pruitt." It was Dorothea Castle from the front row. She had not stood. She spoke in the measured, carrying tone of someone who has never needed volume because the expectation of attention has always preceded her. "You have made your argument. Mrs. Dawson has made hers. I wonder if the council might benefit from hearing from some of the community members present before deliberating." Castle looked at the room. "Is there anyone else who wishes to speak?" Roy Marsh stood. He said 4 sentences. He said he came in with an infected leg. He came out with both legs working. He credited the clinic and specifically Mrs. Dawson with the outcome. And he trusted the council to remember that when it made its decision. He sat down with the air of a man who has said what needed saying and considers the matter closed. Mrs. Calloway stood. She was less brief. She described the labor in terms that were specific and unsparing, and which produced, in the third row, the sound of someone drawing a sharp breath. She said that during the hardest hour of it, when she had been frightened and exhausted and past the point of managing her own fear, Mabel had leaned close and told her exactly what was happening and exactly what to do, and had not left her side. She said she didn't know what the formal word for that was, but she knew what it had meant. She sat down. The baby made a small sound, as if agreeing. 2 more people spoke. The Henderson husband, briefly, and a woman Mabel recognized but couldn't immediately name, who said only that her children asked to see Mrs. Dawson specifically when they were sick, and that she considered this a meaningful data point. The council deliberated for 20 minutes. Mabel sat in her chair and looked at the wall and did not attempt to read the faces of the men at the front table because she had found, in the last 5 months, that reading faces was less reliable than reading records, and the record in this room was what it was. When Castle called the meeting back to order, his expression told her nothing. He was practiced at that. "The council has considered the petition," he said. "It is the finding of this council that the Hale Medical Clinic provides an essential service to this community, and that its current operation has produced documented and verifiable benefit to the residents of Riverbend and the surrounding territory. The council does not find sufficient grounds to require a change in staffing." He paused. "The council does recommend that Dr. Hale pursue formal apprenticeship certification for Mrs. Dawson through the Territorial Medical Association, which would address the standards concern in a constructive manner and provide the community with appropriate documentation going forward. This is a recommendation, not a requirement, and carries no enforcement mechanism." Pruitt said, "I would note for the record," "Noted," Castle said, with the practiced efficiency of a man who has been closing conversations for a long time. "The petition is dismissed. We'll move to the next item." The meeting continued for another 40 minutes on other business. Mabel sat through it with the controlled stillness of someone who is waiting to be somewhere else, not because she was uninterested, but because the thing she was feeling needed space that the council room didn't have. Outside afterward, in the evening air, Roy Marsh shook Hale's hand and nodded at Mabel with the specific respect of a man who measures people by what they do under pressure and has reached his conclusion. Mrs. Calloway hugged Mabel briefly, which was unexpected and not uncomfortable. The Henderson husband said he thought it had gone well, which was an understatement of the kind that Mabel had learned to receive without correction. Dorothea Castle stopped beside her on the way to her carriage. She didn't slow her pace significantly. "Certification," she said without looking at Mabel directly. "Through the Territorial Association. That was Lawrence's contribution to the outcome." "I know," Mabel said. "Please thank him." "Thank him yourself. Come to dinner on Friday." She kept walking. "Bring the children. Lawrence is better with children than he appears." She was in the carriage before Mabel had fully processed the invitation. Hale was beside her. He was looking in the direction of the carriage with the expression he wore when something had resolved differently than the range of outcomes he'd been calculating. "She's inviting us to dinner," Mabel said. "I heard. Is that a significant thing?" "The Castles don't invite people to dinner," he said. "Dorothea considers it an inefficient social format." He paused. "So yes, it's a significant thing." Mabel looked at the council room door, now closed, and the street that had been the site of Cornelius Hatch's public performance 6 months ago, the snow and the one word and the step backward. She looked at where they were now, standing outside a room where a collection of community members had stood up and accounted for what she'd done, had put their names to it, had made it part of the official record of the town. She looked at Hale. "The certification," she said. "The territorial association process. I'd like to start on it." "I expected you would." He turned toward the clinic. "There's a procedural document in the files. I've had it for about 3 months. She stopped walking. He looked back at her. 3 months, she said. "I didn't want to put pressure on Gideon." He had the grace to look directly at her when she used his name like that. "I thought the timing needed to be right," he said. "I was wrong about what right meant." She held his gaze for a moment. There were things she could say about that. Several things, some of them pointed. She chose the practical one. "Get the document out," she said. "Tonight." They walked back to the clinic in the June evening, and the twins were where she'd left them with Mrs. Marsh's care, and Edmund was asleep, and Clara was awake, and regarding the room with her characteristic assessment, and Mabel picked her up and held her and looked at the desk where the plain notebook sat in the second drawer, the record she'd kept for herself, the evidence of what the arrangement had produced. She didn't need it tonight. Tonight the record had spoken in a room full of people and had been sufficient. She put Clara down, opened the filing cabinet, and waited for Hale to find the procedural document. She said yes on a Tuesday morning, which was not a romantic day by any measure. The clinic had been open for 2 hours already. Edmund had knocked a tin cup off the desk and was deeply satisfied with the sound it made. Clara was watching the front door with the concentrated attention she gave to anything that might open and produce something interesting. Mabel was in the middle of updating the Henderson file. Mrs. Henderson's headaches had resolved after Hale adjusted her treatment in March, which Mabel had noted with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had read the right chapter at the right time. When Hale came out of the examination room and stood in the middle of the front room and said what he said. He did not say it well. That was worth noting. He was a man of precise language in clinical settings, but this was not a clinical setting, and the precision failed him in a particular way. He started the sentence, stopped, started a different version of it, and then apparently decided the only available move was to simply say the thing directly and accept whatever happened next. What he said was, "I think we should get married." Mabel set down her pen. "I think," he said, "that it is the practical solution to several problems, and I also think, I want to be clear about this, that I am not proposing it only because it is practical." She looked at him. He was standing in the middle of the room with his hands at his sides, which was unusual. He generally had something in his hands, an instrument, a file, something to do with the mechanics of work. The empty hands made him look more exposed than she'd ever seen him. "What problems," she said, "does it solve?" "The council," he said. "Mrs. Pruitt and what she's been building toward. If you are my wife, the argument about your presence here becomes structurally different. They can object to how I run my clinic, but they cannot instruct me on my household." He paused. "That's the practical component. And the other component." He looked at the window, then back at her. "You have been here 8 months. In those 8 months you've changed how this clinic operates. You've changed how patients talk about what happens here. You've changed..." He stopped, tried again. "I don't want you to leave. That's the other component. I'm aware that this is not a beautifully constructed declaration." "No," she said, "it isn't." "I know." She looked at Edmund, who had found the tin cup again and was examining it with renewed interest. She looked at Clara, who had transferred her attention from the door to this conversation because Clara had always had an instinct for the moments that mattered. She thought about what marriage had meant the first time. Thomas, who had been warm and funny and was gone now in the spring ground outside of Mill Haven. She was not comparing Gideon Hale to Thomas. They were not comparable in any useful way. What she was trying to understand was whether this was a thing she could do for practical reasons and also mean it, or whether meaning it was required first, or whether those two things were even separable in the way people tended to assume they were. "I have 2 children," she said. "I know that." "They're not yours." "I know that as well." His voice was steady. "I also know their names and their approximate sleep schedules, and that Edmund will eat anything that fits in his hand, and that Clara is going to be a problem for everyone when she's old enough to argue." A pause. I don't say that as a complaint. Something shifted in Mabel's chest. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in stories, with some great rush of feeling that resolves everything at once. More like a door settling in its frame. A small, definitive sound. Yes, she said. He blinked. Yes. That was a yes, Gideon. It was the first time she'd used his given name. He appeared to register this. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile and not quite relief. It was the expression of someone who has been holding something carefully for a long time and has just been told he can set it down. All right, he said. All right, she agreed. Edmund dropped the tin cup again. The sound it made was exactly as satisfying the second time. They were married 3 weeks later by the Justice of the Peace, with Roy Marsh and his wife as witnesses, and Eli Marsh holding Edmund for the duration because Edmund had strong opinions about being stationary, and Eli was the only person besides Mabel who'd successfully negotiated with him about it. Clara sat in the crook of Dorothea Castle's arm. Dorothea had arrived without being invited, had seated herself in the front row of the small assembled group, and had reached for Clara with the matter-of-fact authority of a woman who has decided she will be useful and does not require permission to begin. It was not a large ceremony, it was not a particularly sentimental one. Hale said his words in the direct, careful way he said most things, and Mabel said hers, and the Justice of the Peace said the formal words that made it official. And then it was done. Mrs. Pruitt was not there. She had not been invited. She heard about it before noon. The campaign against the clinic did not stop immediately. Mabel hadn't expected it to. She'd understood when she said yes that the marriage would change the structure of the argument, but not the people making it. And people rarely abandon a position simply because the ground beneath it has shifted. What changed was the nature of what could be said publicly and what couldn't. The first council meeting after the wedding was in late June. Lawrence Castle presided, as he usually did. He was the council chairman, which was a position he held with the comfortable authority of a man who has occupied a seat long enough that the seat has begun to take his shape. Hale attended. Mabel did not by design. She and Hale had discussed it and agreed that her presence would make the meeting about her specifically, whereas her absence made it about the clinic's record, which was a stronger argument. Hale came home that evening and sat at the kitchen table and told her what had happened. 2 councilmen had raised concerns about the clinic's expansion. Hale had recently begun talking about adding a second examination room, and the question of funding had come up in ways that allowed the opposition to attach itself to fiscal responsibility rather than personal objection. Franklin Pruitt, Mrs. Pruitt's husband, had been specific. He questioned whether the clinic's recent increase in patient volume was sustainable, whether the quality of care was being diluted by taking on too many cases, and whether he had used the word arrangement, Hale said, with visible distaste, whether the arrangement regarding Mrs. Hale's role had been properly considered from a standards perspective. He said arrangement, Mabel said. He said it twice. What did Castle say? Hale was quiet for a moment. Castle said that his wife had been treated at the clinic in March with a broken wrist, and that the care had been, in his word, exemplary. He said that Roy Marsh's leg was exemplary. He said that the Callaway birth was exemplary. He said that in his experience, exemplary results were not generally produced by arrangements that needed to be reconsidered. He paused. He then asked Pruitt if he had a specific medical complaint about the clinic's practice, or whether he had a social complaint about its personnel, and said that the council was equipped to adjudicate the first kind and had no standing to adjudicate the second. Mabel sat with this. Pruitt backed down? Pruitt said he would be watching the situation. Hale set his hands flat on the table. Which is the thing people say when they've lost the current argument and want to preserve the option to make it again later. He'll try again. Probably. But the ground is different now. He looked at her. Castle is not a man people argue with effectively in public forums. And Dorothea has been, he searched for the word. Active, Mabel said. Active, he agreed. What Dorothea Castle had been doing over the preceding weeks was something that Mabel had observed with a particular mixture of gratitude and rueful recognition. She had been talking, not loudly. Dorothea did not require volume. She talked at the dinners she attended and the social calls she made and the dry goods counter where she conducted the Castle household's considerable purchasing. And what she said, in the measured, unequivocal way she said things, was that the clinic was a credit to the territory and that Mabel Hale was a woman of capability and that people who suggested otherwise were revealing considerably more about themselves than about the subject of their concern. She had also done something more concrete. She'd spoken to two women, both wives of prominent ranching families, who had not yet brought their households to the clinic, and she had told them, simply and directly, that they were missing the best medical care within a 2-day ride, and that whatever they'd heard about the arrangement was, in her word, nonsense. Both families had come in by the end of May. Mabel had thanked her, once, carefully. Dorothea had said, "My mother kept those books for 30 years. I have always believed the debt runs forward, not back." And then she'd changed the subject because Dorothea Castle was not a woman who required acknowledgement for doing what she considered obvious. July brought heat and a diphtheria scare that turned out, on examination, to be a cluster of severe sore throats with no diphtheria present. Mabel had done the intake on 3 of the 5 cases before Hale saw them, and her notes had been specific enough that he'd been able to rule out the serious diagnosis faster than he would have otherwise. Afterward, he told her that her documentation had been decisive, and she'd written that down too, not in the patient log, but in a separate place she kept for things she wanted to remember accurately. The summer also brought a change in how the town addressed her. It was incremental, not a sudden shift. Nothing in Riverbend shifted suddenly unless it was weather or violence, and this was neither. It was the accumulation of small moments. The dry goods clerk who'd previously found reasons to make her wait now served her in order. The women who'd crossed the street now nodded. Mrs. Pruitt herself, encountered outside the post office in late July, did not speak to her but did not look through her either, which was its own category of progress. Children who came to the clinic began to ask for her specifically. Not for everything, not for the things that required Hale's years of formal training, but for the things that children instinctively understand require a specific kind of attention. She did not mistake this for acceptance. She'd learned in the months since December to distinguish between acceptance and the absence of active hostility, and to value the second without confusing it for the first. What she had was a position, a place in the town's daily operation that had been earned through specific documented acts of competence and refused to be dislodged by reputation alone. It was not everything. She'd thought, in her more honest moments, about what everything might look like, and she'd concluded that it probably didn't look like Riverbend in 1883, and that was simply the situation. What she had was enough to work with. She'd made a practice of working with what was available. August produced the first real test of the new arrangement. It came in the form of a letter delivered to the clinic addressed to Dr. Gideon Hale from the Territorial Medical Association. The letter informed Dr. Hale that the association was conducting a review of medical practices in frontier settlements and would be sending an inspector in September. Inspectors were reviewing staffing, patient records, pharmaceutical supplies, and the qualifications of all personnel operating in a clinical capacity. Hale read it twice and set it on the desk. Mabel picked it up and read it once. "Personnel operating in a clinical capacity," she said. "Yes. That would include me." "Yes." He sat down. "The association has specific criteria for what constitutes qualified clinical personnel: trained nurses, licensed physicians, and certified medical apprentices, which I am none of, which you are none of." He looked at the letter, then at her. "Yet." She put the letter down. "What does yet mean, specifically?" "The association also has a provision for apprenticeship certification. It's a formal process: examination, documentation of clinical hours, supervisor attestation. It was designed for frontier settings where formal training isn't accessible." He paused. "I should have raised this months ago. I didn't, which was an oversight. Or you assumed the informal arrangement was sufficient." "I assumed we had more time." He said it plainly, without excusing himself. "We have 6 weeks." 6 weeks was not a generous window. The certification examination covered anatomy, pharmacology, clinical procedure, patient assessment, and medical record keeping. Mabel knew most of it, had been absorbing it for 8 months with the focused attention of someone who understands that knowledge is the only unconfiscatable asset, but knowing something and demonstrating it under examination conditions to a skeptical inspector were different problems. She looked at Edmund, who was asleep in the corner under a blanket that he'd pulled over his own head with the purposeful satisfaction of someone managing his environment. She looked at Clara, who was sitting up very straight and looking at the letter on the desk as though she could read it. "Tell me what the examination covers," Mabel said. He told her. She wrote it down. She made a list of the areas where she was confident and the areas where she was not, and the list was honest. The areas where she was not were real and specific and would require work. That evening, after the clinic closed and the twins were down, she and Hale sat at the desk for 3 hours and went through the pharmacological section, which was the area she was least certain about. Not because she hadn't read it, she had multiple times, but because reading and applying are different, and application under pressure reveals the gaps that reading conceals. He was a thorough teacher when he needed to be. She'd known this from the evening sessions months ago, but the stakes had been different then. Now he pushed harder, asked follow-up questions, presented complications, held the silence after her answers long enough that she couldn't tell whether she'd been right until he told her. She appreciated this, even when it was uncomfortable, especially then. At 11 o'clock, she said, "I'm losing the thread on the contraindication interactions. I need to start over from the base compounds." "Then start over. It's 11 o'clock. The examination is in 6 weeks. Starting over at 11 o'clock is still starting over before tomorrow, which is better than starting over at noon tomorrow." She looked at him. He had the focused, practical expression he wore when he was committed to a problem. "You could have noted the certification requirement earlier," she said. "Yes, I should have. No qualification, no excuse. I'm noting it now." "I know." She pulled the reference text back toward her. "Base compounds. Salicylates first." They worked until past midnight. This became the pattern. Mornings for the clinic, evenings for the preparation, the desk between them covered in papers and open texts and Mabel's notes in her small, even hand. Hale did not coddle her through it. He identified what she didn't know and addressed it without softening the gap, which was the most useful thing he could have done and would have been insufferable from anyone she trusted less. 3 weeks in, he gave her a practice examination. Written, formal, timed. He sat at the other end of the desk and worked on patient files while she wrote, and when she finished, he took the papers and went over them that evening and came back the next morning with marks and notes in the margins. She passed the clinical procedure section without difficulty. She passed the patient assessment section. She fell short on 2 subsections of pharmacology and 1 on anatomy. "The wrist and hand," he said, tapping the anatomy section. "I know, I thought I had it. You have the structure. You're inconsistent on the nerve pathways under compression. I'll go back through it. There's a model in the cabinet, the articulated hand. Work with it physically, not just from the diagram. The 3-dimensional reference helps the pathways stick." She got the articulated hand model from the cabinet that evening and worked with it for 2 hours after midnight, tracing the nerve pathways with her finger until the rotes stopped being abstract and became spatial, physical, real, in the way that things become real when your hands know them. By the 5th week, she was passing all sections of the practice examination consistently, not perfectly. There were still gaps, still moments where she reached for something and found it slightly out of focus, but consistently, which was the standard required. The 6th week brought something she hadn't anticipated. Word had gotten around Riverbend that the clinic was facing an inspection and that Mabel's position was under review. She didn't know exactly how. Riverbend had its own circulatory system for information, and she'd long since stopped trying to understand its specific pathways. But by the start of the 6th week, she was aware that people knew. What she hadn't expected was what people did with that knowledge. Roy Marsh came in on a Monday morning, not as a patient. He stood at the front desk and said, without preamble, "I heard there's an inspector coming about your position here." "That's correct," she said. "I want to write something," he said, for the record, about the leg. Does that help?" She looked at him. Roy Marsh was not a man who volunteered statements. He was a man who managed his land, raised his son, and kept his own counsel on most matters. The fact that he was standing at her front desk offering to put something in writing was not a small thing. "It might help," she said carefully. "Then I'll write it. Eli can help me with the wording." He paused. "He's been wanting to say something anyway, about what you showed him. He practices the dressing technique on his own arm sometimes. Did you know that?" "I didn't." He's going to be a doctor. Roy said it with the flat certainty of a man reporting an established fact. He told me in February. I thought he was fooling around. He was not fooling around. He turned to leave. I'll send the letter by Wednesday. The letter arrived Wednesday. 2 more arrived Thursday. 1 from Mrs. Calloway, 1 from the Henderson family. By Friday there were 6. By the following Monday there were 11. They were not all eloquent. Several were straightforward to the point of simplicity. This woman helped my family. I recommend her. Signed. Some were more specific. Mrs. Calloway's was 3 pages and detailed the labor in language that was direct and unsparing and deeply convincing in exactly the way that first-hand accounts are convincing when they're true. Eli's contribution, which was a separate page attached to his father's letter, described the wound dressing procedure with technical accuracy that surprised her and ended with, "Mrs. Hale taught me that competence is something you practice until it becomes automatic. I have found this to be correct." She read that line twice. She didn't tell him she'd read it. Dorothea Castle's letter was brief, precise, and almost certainly the most effective thing in the file. It did not recount a medical incident. It made an argument that frontier medicine had always depended on practitioners who'd developed expertise outside formal channels, that the territories had been shaped by people who'd learned by necessity and proven themselves through outcomes, and that the inspection criteria should be applied to what the practitioner could do, not to the institutional path by which they'd learned to do it. It was, Mabel thought, the kind of argument that worked on people who thought in structures, which inspectors generally did. She put all 11 letters in a folder and placed them at the front of the patient documentation file. The inspector arrived on a Tuesday in September, which was at least consistent. Tuesdays, in Mabel's experience, tended to be the days when things were decided. His name was Aldrich. He was somewhere in his late 50s. He had the traveling face of someone who has been to many frontier towns and developed a calibrated skepticism about all of them. He shook Hale's hand and looked at Mabel with the specific neutral expression of a man who has already been briefed about the situation and is now conducting his own assessment. He spent 4 hours in the clinic. He reviewed the patient records first, all of them, going back to December, including the intake notes in Mabel's handwriting and the evening documentation she'd compiled alongside Hale's formal records. He asked her questions while he read, specific questions about specific cases, and she answered them directly and didn't elaborate past the point of what was asked. He examined the supply cabinet. He reviewed the pharmaceutical log. He looked at the articulated hand model on the shelf and asked her, without warning, to describe the median nerve pathway under carpal compression, and she did, tracing it in the air with one finger, and the description was correct and specific and delivered without hesitation. He gave her the written examination in the afternoon. She took it at the front desk while Hale saw patients in the back room, and Edmund slept in his corner, and Clara watched Aldrich with the focused attention she gave to strangers she hadn't decided about yet. When she finished and handed the papers back, Aldrich looked at them for a long time. He turned several pages, he made notes. He picked up the folder with the 11 letters and read through them, and his expression did not change while he read, which told her nothing useful. At the end, he set everything in a neat stack and looked at her directly. "Your pharmacological documentation is thorough," he said. "Your patient assessment records are better than what I typically see from formally trained nurses. Your examination results are in the upper range of what we certify at the apprenticeship level." He paused. "You have also apparently made a significant impression on this town's residents." She waited. "The certification will be processed through the territorial office," he said. "You'll receive formal documentation within 30 days. In the interim, you're operating under provisional certification as of today." She heard herself say thank you, and meant it, but she said it once and didn't elaborate because the moment was not one that required additional words. After Aldrich left, the clinic was quiet for a few minutes. Hale came out of the examination room and looked at her face and understood what had happened before she said anything. "The letters helped," she said. "Yes." He sat on the edge of the desk. "So did 8 months of work." "The letters were... I didn't ask anyone for them." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "Roy Marsh came to me before he came to you. He wanted to know if it was appropriate to write something. I told him I thought it was more than appropriate. I told him I thought it was necessary." He paused. "I should have told you I was doing that. I didn't because I wasn't sure it would amount to anything, and I didn't want to raise something I couldn't deliver. She looked at him. You should have told me. Yes, I should have. Direct, no cushion. I'm telling you now. She nodded. It wasn't a small thing, what he'd done. Going to Roy Marsh, planting the idea, trusting that the right people would respond. It was also not the kind of thing she could have done for herself, which was uncomfortable to acknowledge because she'd spent 8 months doing things for herself, and the distinction between independence and stubbornness had occasionally been thin. Next time tell me, she said. Next time I will. Outside, Riverbend was doing its late afternoon business. The sun angling long and low, the sound of commerce and conversation, and the ordinary texture of a town that kept moving regardless of what got resolved inside it. Mabel stood at the front window and looked out at the main street that she'd arrived on in December with $7.40 and 2 infants and a man's public rejection still fresh in the cold air. She thought about what Cornelius Hatch had said. One word, one step backward. The performance of discernment from a man who'd spent years practicing the theater of high standards in place of having any. She thought about what Eli Marsh had written. Competence is something you practice until it becomes automatic. She thought about her mother-in-law's face when Vera had read that advertisement aloud at the kitchen table, and the way the room had already felt like a door closing, and what it had taken to walk through it anyway. Clara made a sound from her corner. It was not a distressed sound, it was the particular sound she made when she'd decided something. A small declarative noise that meant the assessment was complete and a conclusion had been reached. Mabel had learned to recognize it. I know, Mabel said, without turning from the window. She stood there another minute, looking at the main street of Riverbend in the September light, and then she went back to the desk and opened the patient log and began preparing for the next morning. The certification document arrived on a Thursday in October, 31 days after Aldrich had left Riverbend. Mabel was at the front desk when the postboy brought it, a thick envelope from the Territorial Medical Association, addressed to Mrs. Mabel Hale, apprentice medical practitioner, CDO Hale Medical Clinic, Riverbend. She signed for it and set it on the desk and looked at it for a moment before opening it, the way you look at something you've been waiting for long enough that the arrival feels slightly unreal. The document inside was formal, heavy paper, official seal, the language of institutions that want you to understand they take themselves seriously. It certified that Mabel Ruth Hale had successfully completed the requirements for apprenticeship certification under the Territorial Medical Association's Frontier Practice provisions, effective the date of examination, and was recognized as a qualified medical apprentice authorized to practice under the supervision of a licensed physician in the territory. Her name, in official language, on paper with a seal. She read it twice. Then she put it back in the envelope and placed the envelope in the second drawer, the one where she kept the plain notebook she'd filled during the spring, the private record of what the clinic had produced before anyone official was willing to say so. She put the certification on top of the notebook, in the same drawer, which felt right in a way she didn't try to articulate. Hale came out of the examination room and looked at her face. It came, he said. Yes. He waited, which was what he did when he understood that someone needed a moment to arrive at something without being escorted there. It's real, she said finally. Not to him specifically, more like confirming it to the room. Yes, he said. It is. He went to the supply cabinet and began the afternoon inventory, giving her the space to sit with it, which was one of the things about him she'd learned to recognize and be grateful for. He understood that some things needed room rather than response. She opened this drawer again, looked at the envelope once more, and then closed it and picked up the patient log and went back to work. What changed after the certification arrived was not dramatic. That was the thing she hadn't fully understood beforehand. She'd expected something to feel different, some marked shift in how the days sat, some clear before and after. Instead, what happened was that the work continued, the same work it had always been, and the paper in the drawer confirmed something that had already been true for months. The certification didn't create her competence. It documented it. The distinction mattered to her, though she couldn't have said precisely why until later. What did change was smaller and more specific. The patients who'd been cautious, the ones who'd come in and looked past her for Hale, who'd answered her questions with the minimal cooperation of people being polite to someone they weren't sure counted, those patients gradually stopped doing that. It wasn't a sudden shift. It was the slow turn of a tide, the kind you don't notice happening, and then one day notice has happened. She'd ask an intake question and get a full answer. She'd offer an assessment and see it received rather than withheld. A woman whose name she didn't know stopped her on the main street in late October to ask about her daughter's persistent cough. Not stopped her near the clinic, not stopped her intending to book an appointment, just stopped her on the street and asked, the way you ask someone whose knowledge you trust when you see them in a context where it happens to be available. She answered the question. She recommended the daughter come in if the cough continued past a week. The woman thanked her and moved on. Mabel walked the rest of the way to the dry goods store thinking about what had just happened. Not the medical content, the social fact. She had been stopped on a street in Riverbend by someone who wanted her professional opinion. That was a sentence she could not have written about herself in December, and now it was simply a thing that had occurred on a Tuesday afternoon. Eli Marsh turned 10 in November. His mother brought him to the clinic for what she described as a general wellness check, which was a pretext. He was visibly healthy. But Mabel conducted it thoroughly anyway, because Eli submitted to the examination with the focused attention of someone taking notes, which she recognized, and because Mrs. Marsh's real purpose was apparent, she wanted Eli to spend time in the clinic, to see it as a place he could belong to eventually. Afterward, Eli sat in the patient chair while his mother spoke to Hale about a minor matter of her own, and he looked at the articulated hand model on the shelf. "Can I look at it?" he said. Mabel got it down and put it on the desk in front of him. He handled it carefully, turning it, working the articulated joints with the same precision he'd brought to the wound dressing months ago. "Mrs. Hale," he said, without looking up, "if I wanted to study medicine properly when I'm old enough, how does someone do that?" She sat across the desk from him. "There are medical colleges," she said. "There's one in St. Louis and one in Chicago that takes students from the territories. You'd need preparatory schooling first, science, Latin for the pharmaceutical nomenclature, mathematics. The process takes years." "How many years?" "From where you are now, 8 to 10 before you'd be practicing." He put the hand model down and looked at her. "That's a long time." "Yes, it is." "Did it seem long to you, learning?" She thought about this honestly. "No," she said. "It seemed urgent, which is different from long." She paused. "When you want to know something badly enough, the time it takes doesn't feel like waiting. It feels like the work itself." He nodded slowly, the nod of someone filing information rather than agreeing with a sentiment. "Your father's leg," she said. "Does he still have full mobility?" "Yes, he almost doesn't limp anymore when it's cold." He picked up the hand model again. "He talks about it sometimes. What would have happened?" "He shouldn't spend too much time on that." "He doesn't. He mostly says you were direct with him about what needed doing, and that he respected it." Eli set the model down for the final time and pushed it carefully back toward her side of the desk. "He said a lot of people are kind about hard things. He said you were honest, which he thought was better." She put the model back on the shelf. After the Marshes left, she stood at the desk for a while. She was thinking about honest and kind, and whether they were actually opposed or whether people just assumed they were, because honesty is so often deployed as a weapon and kindness so often used as an evasion. In her experience, the most useful thing you could be was honest about the reality and kind about the person inside it. Tell them what was true. Treat them as someone capable of handling what was true. That wasn't a contradiction. It was just harder than either one alone. November also brought news from elsewhere in the territory. The kind of news that arrives in frontier towns through a combination of letters, passing travelers, and the organic telegraph of people who talk to people who know people. What arrived about Cornelius Hatch was not dramatic. It was the steady, undramatic news of a man whose public performance has outlasted its foundations. The first piece of it came through Dorothea, who mentioned it at the Friday dinner that had become a monthly arrangement. Not every Friday, but the first Friday of each month, when Lawrence Castle presided over his table with the comfortable authority of a man who has earned the right to enjoy what he's built, and Dorothea ran the conversation with the invisible precision of someone managing a complex instrument. Edmund had taken to Lawrence Castle in the specific way that toddlers take to large, calm men who don't perform friendliness at them, which meant Lawrence Castle had spent 3 dinners with a small boy sitting near his feet in apparent contentment, regarding this development with the baffled satisfaction of someone who has been chosen and doesn't fully understand why. What Dorothea mentioned, between the soup and the main course, was that Hatch's commercial relationship with the Northern Supply Company had concluded. Concluded, Mabel said. They declined to renew his contract, Dorothea said, in the tone she used for things she considered both unsurprising and mildly satisfying. Apparently his credit extended past his actual holdings by a considerable margin, and when they did a proper accounting, which they should have done 2 years ago, the numbers didn't sustain the arrangement, Lawrence said, without looking up from his plate. He's been running the appearance of prosperity for longer than the substance of it. That's a common way to run things, Hale said. For a while, Lawrence agreed, until it isn't. Mabel thought about the man on the platform in December, the one word, the step backward, the performance of discernment. She thought about what Hale had told her then, that Hatch had done it twice before, sent women back on the return coach, positioned public rejection as the evidence of high standards. She thought about what it costs to build an identity on what you refuse rather than what you do. Is he going to be all right? She said, and was slightly surprised to find she meant it as an actual question rather than a rhetorical one. Dorothea looked at her with the direct, appraising look she gave to things that interested her. Probably, she said. Men like Hatch generally find a way to reposition. He'll go somewhere where the recent history isn't known and construct the same performance on different ground. And the women he... Mabel stopped. The women he invited and dismissed. Dorothea's voice was even. They went somewhere else and did something else with their lives, as you did. The table was quiet for a moment. As I did, Mabel said. Clara, who had been sitting beside Mabel in the high-backed chair that Lawrence had produced from somewhere before their second dinner visit, produced it without mentioning it, without drawing attention to the fact that he'd acquired a chair appropriate for a toddler, simply had it there when they arrived, which was the castle version of warmth. Clara chose this moment to point at the centerpiece flowers and say a word that was almost certainly her version of pretty, though her version was approximately one consonant away from an entirely different word, which caused Lawrence Castle to produce a sound that was, for him, extraordinarily close to a laugh. The table relaxed. The conversation moved on. On the walk home, with Edmund asleep against Hale's shoulder, and Clara walking the last of her evening energy out between them, Mabel said, "He'll do it again. Hatch. Somewhere else." "Probably," Hale said. "There's nothing to be done about that." "No." He adjusted Edmund's weight slightly. "Some things you can change and some things you can only leave behind." She looked at him. He was looking at the street ahead, the familiar length of Riverbend's main road in the November dark, the lamplight in the windows. "Do you think about your wife?" she said. She'd known about her for months. Hale had mentioned her once, in the spring, in the specific way of someone who has chosen to say a thing once, and clearly rather than have it surface unexpectedly. Her name had been Alice. She'd died in the second year of the clinic from a fever that progressed faster than anyone anticipated, and the clinic had been what remained when she was gone, the daily work of it, the only thing that held its shape. He was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes," he said, "less than I used to. Not because she mattered less, but because..." He paused. "The shape of what's present changes what you're comparing it to." Mabel walked a few steps. "Thomas was funny," she said. "That's what I missed that I didn't expect to miss. He could make anything funny without being unkind about it. I don't know how he did that." She paused. "I'm not funny." "No," Haley agreed, which she appreciated. Some people would have argued with the statement as a form of comfort, and it would have been both wrong and beside the point. "You're also not funny," she said. "No, I'm aware. We're a very serious household." "Edmund laughs at the tin cup." "Edmund laughs at the tin cup," she agreed. "So we have that." Clara grabbed her hand in the dark, the small, firm grip that children use when they've decided a connection needs to be established. And Mabel held on, and they walked the rest of the way home in the specific quiet of a family that has earned the right to be quiet together. December came. The first of it she barely noticed. She was busy with the clinic's increased winter load, the same cold weather patterns she'd learned the previous year, but now managed with a year's additional knowledge and a formal credential in the second drawer and an understanding of Riverbend's specific medical landscape that no textbook had given her and no examination had tested. She knew which families put off coming in until things were past manageable. She knew which children ran fevers that looked alarming and resolved quickly, and which ones needed to come in tonight. She knew which of the older homesteaders would not ask for help until the asking was past emergency, and she'd developed a system, informal, unacknowledged, of follow-up that meant she knew about the situation before they decided to mention it. None of this was in the certification document. All of it was in the plain notebook in the second drawer, and increasingly in the patient log, and most importantly in the accumulated tissue of small daily decisions that constitutes, over time, what it means to actually know a community rather than simply know about medicine. The anniversary of her arrival was the 19th of December. She didn't mark it with anything specific. She noted it, the way you note things that have meaning even when marking them seems both necessary and insufficient. 1 year since the platform, the snow, the one word. 1 year since the door of G. Hale, M.D., and the stove burning in the corner and a man who looked at her children's faces rather than at her body and said the temperature was low enough to matter. She was thinking about this on the morning of the 19th when Eli Marsh appeared at the clinic door without his mother. He was alone, which was not unusual for him. He'd been coming to the clinic independently for months, sometimes with a legitimate pretext and sometimes, she suspected, simply because the clinic was a place he wanted to be. He came in and sat in the patient chair and looked at his hands. "Are you hurt?" she said. "No." He looked up. "I wanted to tell you something." "All right." "I told my teacher I want to be a doctor, Mr. Ferris." He said the name with the particular neutrality of someone reporting on a person they've decided to be accurate rather than kind about. He said that was an admirable goal for someone in my circumstances, but that I should consider practical alternatives. Mabel set down her pen. "What did you say?" "I said thank you." He paused. "And then I went home and wrote to the preparatory program in Mill Haven that Dr. Hale told me about, to ask about requirements." She looked at him. He was 10 years old, sitting very straight in the patient chair, with the expression of someone who has made a decision and come to report it to the person whose response matters most to him in this context. "What did Dr. Hale say when you asked him about the program?" she said. "He said the science requirements were manageable if I started now. He said Latin was harder, and I should not underestimate it." A pause. "He said I had the disposition for it. He said disposition matters more than people think, because medicine is mostly showing up and paying attention, and a lot of people find both of those things harder than the learning." "He's right." "I know." Eli looked at the hand model on the shelf. "Mrs. Hale, when you were my age, did you know what you were going to do?" She thought about herself at 10. The schoolroom in Ohio, the teacher who'd told her she had a gift for written language, but that gifts in women tended to find their expression in domestic application. The way she'd absorbed that, filed it, and spent 20 years assuming it was true before she ended up in a storage room behind a medical clinic with 2 babies and a question list in her left pocket. "No," she said. "At your age, I had no idea. I didn't know until necessity made the decision for me." She paused. "Which is not the same as choosing. I want to be clear about that. Necessity moved me in a direction. I chose what to do with the direction once I was in it. Those are different things, and it matters to know which one is which." Eli nodded. "Mr. Ferris thinks necessity and choice are the same thing for people like me." "Mr. Ferris," she said carefully, "is operating with a limited set of examples." She looked at him directly. "Right back to the program in Mill Haven. Tell me what they say." He nodded again, the filing nod. He stood and straightened his coat with the particular dignity of a 10-year-old who takes himself seriously and has good reasons to. "Thank you," he said. "You don't need to thank me for anything." "I know." He paused at the door. "I'm thanking you anyway." He left. Mabel sat at the desk for a while after, thinking about necessity and choice and the space between them, and whether the most important decisions of a life are the ones you make or the ones you make something out of. She didn't arrive at a clean resolution because the question wasn't that kind of question. It was the kind you live with, return to, find slightly different each time depending on where you're standing when you ask it. January came. The twins turned 1 year old, which produced in Mabel a reaction she hadn't fully anticipated. Not sentiment exactly, but something more like reckoning. A year. Edmund, who had arrived in Riverbend strapped to her left side, screaming at the cold, could now walk holding on to things and had strong opinions about what things were appropriate to hold on to. Clara, who had regarded the clinic's ceiling with the focused attention of a small scientist on her first day in this room, could say approximately 11 words, 4 of which were names. Mama, Edmund's version of his own name, something that was clearly Hale regardless of how it came out, and a word that was unmistakably her version of Eli, which had produced in Eli Marsh, when he first heard it, an expression of such surprised pleasure that he'd had to look at the floor for a moment to collect himself. Hale's practice of medicine had not become warmer in the year Mabel had known him. He was not, at his core, a warm man. He was a precise one, a thorough one, a man whose care for people expressed itself through the quality of his attention rather than through its emotional temperature. She'd stopped expecting it to change and started appreciating what it actually was, which was more durable than warmth and in some ways more useful. He showed up. He paid attention. He remembered what you'd told him 3 visits ago and incorporated it into what he was doing now. That consistency, across a year of difficult and ordinary cases, had built something in Riverbend that had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with trust. What surprised her, and continued to surprise her, was how the two of them worked together in the clinic. Not always smoothly. They disagreed about patient management more regularly than either of them had anticipated, and the disagreements were real rather than performative, the kind that require both parties to make an actual argument rather than defer or concede for the sake of the room's temperature. He was more conservative than she was in certain areas of treatment. She was more aggressive than he was in following up with patients who weren't presenting with acute problems, but whose ongoing situations concerned her. They'd learned to work with the difference, not to flatten it, but to use it, to let her instinct for the relational and his instinct for the clinical pull against each other productively. It was not a partnership without friction. She wouldn't have trusted it if it were. February brought a letter from the Territorial Medical Association. Not a document this time. Correspondence, addressed to both Dr. Gideon Hale and Mrs. Mabel Hale, informing them that the association was establishing a frontier medicine advisory panel and requesting that Dr. Hale consider joining as a representative of the Riverbend Territory's medical community. A handwritten postscript at the bottom of the letter, in the Inspector Aldrich's cramped hand, noted that Mrs. Hale's examination results had been among the highest recorded under the frontier apprenticeship provisions, and that the association was considering whether a formal recognition program for exceptional frontier apprentices might be worth developing, and would she be willing to correspond about her experience. She read the postscript 3 times. Hale read it once. "Will you write back?" "Yes." "Good." He set the letter down and went back to the patient file he'd been reviewing. She looked at him. "That's all you're going to say?" "What else should I say? You'll write back. It's the right thing to do." He glanced up. "You're good at the correspondence. Your letters are better than mine." "You said that about my intake records 9 months ago." "Both things are still true." He went back to the file. "Write back to Aldrich. Be direct about what the program should include. He'll respect directness." She wrote to Aldrich that evening after the twins were down and the clinic was quiet. She was direct. She told him what the apprenticeship experience had actually required, what the formal curriculum had missed and what it had gotten right, what the examination had tested and what it had failed to test. She told him that frontier medicine's primary challenge was not competence but continuity, the ability to maintain patient relationships across time, to manage the full complexity of a person's health rather than a series of isolated presenting complaints, and that any recognition program worth developing should find a way to assess that rather than just the clinical knowledge that examinations measured. She read it back before she sealed it. It was a good letter. She knew it was a good letter, which was not vanity. It was the same quality of accurate self-assessment she tried to bring to everything else. She sent it. March came and the clinic expanded, not into a second building. The financing for that was still a future conversation, but into a second examination room that had been the storage room Mabel herself had cleared in December of the previous year, the room where she'd set up a cot and a padded drawer and thought that this was a temporary arrangement until she figured out what came next. The cot was gone now. The twins had graduated to a proper room in the living quarters that Hale had reorganized, quietly and without announcement, sometime in January, producing the space the way Lawrence Castle had produced the high-backed chair, simply having it done before it was mentioned. The second examination room was Mabel's in practical terms, though they didn't formalize it that way. It was where she saw the patients who came specifically for her, which was a category that had solidified over the course of the year into something real and specific. The women who needed to talk while they were being examined, the children who needed someone to explain rather than simply treat, the older patients who needed their concerns taken seriously rather than managed. These were not exclusively her domain. Hale was not incapable of any of these things. But they gravitated to her, and she to them, and the clinic was better for the sorting. One afternoon in late March, Mrs. Pruitt came in. Mabel was at the front desk. She registered who it was and experienced, for a brief moment, the precise memory of every piece of information that had come to her via Mrs. Pruitt's opinions over the preceding 14 months. The comments at the dry goods store, the question of why Hale kept that woman on, the word unsuitable deployed like a tool. The memory was there and then it wasn't, the way you smell something from a long time ago and it's vivid and then gone. "Mrs. Pruitt," she said, "are you here as a patient?" "My husband." Mrs. Pruitt did not meet her eyes directly. She was looking at a point just past Mabel's shoulder, the specific gaze of someone who has come somewhere difficult and is managing it by not quite looking at what they've come to. "He has a chest complaint. It's been 2 weeks. I tried to get him to come in sooner." "Of course, sit down, please. I'll get Dr. Hale." She got Hale. He examined Franklin Pruitt, who had come in behind his wife, she saw, who was a smaller man in person than the figure she'd constructed from his letter and his presence at the council meeting, who looked tired and was breathing with the careful deliberateness of someone who has learned that certain movements cost more than others. Hale diagnosed a bronchial infection and a secondary concern about fluid retention that warranted monitoring. He was thorough and direct and explained everything clearly, and Franklin Pruitt listened and asked 2 practical questions and nodded. Mabel handled the intake and the medication log. She was professional and correct, the same way she would have been with any patient. At the end, while Hale was writing the prescription, Mrs. Pruitt sat in the front room. Mabel was updating the file at the desk. The room was quiet in the specific way it gets quiet when something unspoken is present. Mrs. Pruitt said, "He should have come in 3 weeks ago." "Probably," Mabel said. "I told him to." "I believe you." Another silence. Mrs. Pruitt's hands were in her lap, clasped in the way of someone holding on to something. "Is he going to be all right?" she said. Mabel looked up from the file. Mrs. Pruitt was, for the first time in Mabel's experience of her, simply a woman sitting in a chair being frightened about her husband. Not a social position, not an opinion, not a campaign, just a person who had come to the place people come to when they need help. "The infection is serious but manageable," Mabel said. "He needs to rest and take the medication correctly and come back in 10 days. If he does those 3 things, yes, he should be all right." Mrs. Pruitt exhaled. The sound of it was not performed. It was the sound of an actually held breath releasing. She didn't say anything else. She didn't apologize, which Mabel hadn't expected, and which in a strange way she respected. An apology at this point would have been about the person offering it rather than the person receiving it, and Mrs. Pruitt, whatever her faults, was not a sentimental woman. She sat until Hale came out with the prescription, and then she stood and took her husband's arm and thanked Hale and looked briefly at Mabel with an expression that was not quite acknowledgement and not quite gratitude but was something in the territory of both. And then they left. Hale came to stand beside her at the desk. "That was," he started. "It was a patient visit," Mabel said. "Write it up the same as any other." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded and went to his files. Spring arrived with the particular quality of light that makes the frontier look like a different country. The long gold evenings, the smell of things starting rather than ending, the way the mud season gives way to something firmer underfoot. The clinic's garden, which Mabel had planted in the fall against the south wall, was showing signs of the herb seedlings she'd put in. Lavender, yarrow, the plantain she'd learned about from Hale's notes on Roy Marsh's leg, things that weren't medicine in themselves but were part of the toolkit available when the toolkit needed to be broad. Edmund had discovered the garden and had opinions about all of it, most of them expressed through his hands. Clara had found the second drawer. Mabel discovered this on an April morning, Clara sitting on the floor beside the desk with the plain notebook open in her lap, running her fingers over the pages in the same way she ran them over everything that interested her, which was most things. The notebook with the private record, the documentation of what the clinic had produced before anyone official was willing to say so. Mabel sat down on the floor beside her. "That's mine," she said. Looked at her with the dark, serious attention she'd been bringing to the world since she was 8 weeks old. "It's from before you could sit up," Mabel said. "Before you could walk. Before any of this." She looked at the pages, her own handwriting, the small, even hand, the record of names and dates and outcomes, and the evidence that a thing was happening that was real and worth defending. "I wrote down what I was doing so that I could prove it had happened, so that no one could say it hadn't." Clara touched the page. "You'll do things that people say you can't," Mabel said. That's the situation. It's not fair, and it's not going to stop being the situation just because it isn't fair. But the answer to it isn't to become smaller. The answer is to keep the record." She paused. "Do the work where people can see it, and document what it produces, and let the record speak when you need it to." Clara closed the notebook with the decisive satisfaction of a person who has reached the end of a thing. Mabel looked at her daughter. She was not going to tell her the road was easier than it was. She was not going to tell her that the world would eventually catch up to her worth and recognize it properly. She was not that kind of optimist, had never been, and the women who'd told her comfortable things had helped her less than the women who'd told her true ones. What she would tell her, when she was old enough to hear it, that the thing people use against you is never really about you. The weight they assign to your body, the credentials they demand from you that they don't demand from others. The public step backward, and the one cold word, these are not judgments of your worth. They are the performance of people who have decided that the categories they've inherited are more important than what's actually in front of them. You cannot fix that in them. You can only refuse to organize your life around it. She put the notebook back in the drawer and closed it. Outside, Riverbend was moving through its morning. The sound of it familiar now, the specific texture of a place she knew, its rhythms and its people and its complications. The main street where she'd arrived in the snow. The dry goods store whose clerk now served her without theater. The council room above the land office, where 11 people had stood up and accounted for what she'd done. The post office where the letter had arrived with her name on it, official and sealed, confirming what had already been true. She was not at peace with everything. She wasn't, in her most honest assessment, a woman who arrived at peace particularly. She was a woman who found the next problem and addressed it, who looked at what was available and figured out what to make of it, who kept the record and showed up, and let the work be the argument. That was not a romantic version of herself, but it was an accurate one, and she'd found that accuracy was more useful than romance in most of the situations life had presented her with. Hale came through the front room on his way to start the morning. He paused at the desk, looked at her on the floor, looked at Clara sitting beside her. "The Calloway girl is coming in this morning," he said. 6-month check. "I know, I scheduled it. The Henderson follow-up is at 11. Also in the log." He looked at her for a moment with the look she knew, the one that wasn't quite affection and wasn't quite assessment, but was something that lived in the space between the two, something that had developed over 14 months of working beside each other in close quarters and had become, without either of them naming it, one of the reliable things. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. He went to the examination room. She got up from the floor and lifted Clara and settled her on her hip, and went to the desk and opened the patient log and began to prepare for the day. Edmund came toddling in from the back room, found the tin cup exactly where he'd left it the night before, and dropped it on the floor with the satisfied authority of someone restoring the correct order of things. The sound it made was exactly right. It always was. Outside, the April light came through the front window at the angle it took in the mornings, long and clean and falling across the desk and the patient log and the second drawer and everything that was in it, the plain notebook and the sealed envelope and the record of a year that had started with one word in the snow and ended somewhere that word could not have predicted. She picked up her pen. She began to write.